And welcome to another edition of Hank Unplugged, the podcast that is making a difference all around the world. I want to start this podcast by doing a little housekeeping. And the main thing I want to do in this regard is to suggest to everyone listening in that you go to iTunes and give this a 5-star rating that will cause this podcast to touch the lives of people. I'm bringing some of the most interesting, informative, inspiring people to you, people that I've known well, people that are making a difference for time and for eternity. So again, go to iTunes and give the podcast a 5-star rating and share the podcast, subscribe, let other people know what's going on. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of talking to someone that I've gotten to know over the last few years. His name is Father Themi. He was born in Egypt. He grew up in Australia where he explored Marxism and became a rock star. Eventually, he got a master's at Princeton and a doctorate at Brown. But now he is doing something that I think is probably more important in terms of an example to all of us, and that is he's an Orthodox father, a monk in Sierra Leone. This is one of the most impoverished places on the entire planet, and there's a story behind Father Themi going to Sierra Leone. We'll talk about all of that and more on today's podcast. Father Themi, I'm just so grateful to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Hank. And finally, after a couple of false starts, we finally got it. Anyway, how are you, Hank?
Well, I'm doing great. You know, I've gone through a lot of chemotherapy, and I haven't really missed a beat. The Lord has given me strength that's incredible. And I'll say in that regard, Father Themi, that I was so encouraged. You were one of the first people to call me, and you said, I'll never forget, you said, Hank, West Africa is praying for you. And the prayers of God's people have sustained me.
Well, I'll tell you something else that should sustain you as well. Today, in our time here in Melbourne, it is now Thursday, and it's like we just finished a church service for Saint Nektarios. For your listeners who don't know who that is, Saint Nektarios is a contemporary saint, one who lived in the 20th century and died in the 20th century. He's a saint who has experienced, what an airplane is, what a telephone is, what a radio is. We don't get many saints who know what telephones are or who know what airplanes are or cars. Most of the Catholic and Orthodox saints lived, 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. But this Saint Nektarios is a contemporary saint of our time who suffered enormously. He suffered persecution even within the church, even by Christians. Fellow Christians persecuted him, and he was accused of this, accused of that, accused of everything you can think of, but he persevered. He didn't hit back. He didn't strike back. He prayed for his enemies. He prayed for those who were jealous. He was actually an archbishop, but they had kicked him out of the church. He couldn't preach. He couldn't do any services. He went through a terrible time, and they accused him of so many things. And eventually, the Lord clarified everything, and the Lord justified him. And those people now that were persecuting him were the very people who eventually realized who he was, and he's now a saint. He's now a saint. So in this world, my friend, there will be persecution, and by Christians against Christians, and that is the most horrible and the most painful and the most distasteful. When the atheist persecutes me, I am glad because I receive blessings from the Lord. But when my fellow Christians persecute me, or my fellow Christians, condemn me, when my fellow Christians, dishonor me, then I praise the Lord for that, but it's more painful. It's more painful, So that is who Saint Nektarios is, and I offer his example and his strength, because I believe that you're going through a very similar situation, Hank.
Well, it has been an interesting situation, and I often think about what you have just said in terms of the words of Jesus Christ. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is
Correct.
the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And, when I think about persecution, honestly, Father Themi, what I'm going through in terms of persecution is very minimal. When you think about the kinds of persecutions that people are facing in the Middle East, where there's mass genocide with respect to Christians that are brothers and sisters, and that's squarely in the blind spot of the West.
The Coptic Church, for example, the Coptic people in Egypt, what they have to go through, and the Christians in Syria and the Christians in Pakistan. There's a blasphemy law that if you say anything contrary to the Quran, and you can be killed. And sometimes people may falsify. Listen, I don't like you. I don't like Hank, so I'll find something and I'll say, you blasphemed, you spoke against the prophet, therefore I will condemn you, and I'll get your property or something like that. So these poor Christians, what they have to go through, you're right. But you also are facing a different form of persecution. And to my mind, it's a bit strange that fellow Christians of another persuasion should consider that the Orthodox Church is idolatry, or the Orthodox Church is a non-authentically Christian tradition, when in fact it is the tradition that gave us the New Testament. It is the tradition that hangs on to the apostolic teaching. So I find that either they have a very superficial knowledge of the Orthodox Church, or else maybe we Orthodox haven't done our work properly to present the Church to the Western world. So perhaps it's a two-way blame,
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there are two things going on. Oftentimes, I liken this to a jewel. And you take a jewel, and the metaphor actually might go well with what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13, where a man finds a pearl of great price, and he sells everything he has to possess that pearl. But the problem is, oftentimes within Orthodoxy, you have those people who have the pearl, but the pearl's in a box to protect the pearl, and then there's another box around the box to protect that box and the pearl, and pretty soon you lose touch with the pearl itself.
Right, that's right. That's 100% right. And I think the Orthodox Church in the Western world has a duty to witness its tradition, because after all, it has a 2,000-year history. So surely some people would be interested in that. Surely some people will be interested. And I think, Brother Hank, I think that's sort of like your new challenge, my friend.
Yeah, so it's not only that people within the church don't have an understanding of the pearl that they possess, but people outside the church, they don't know what Orthodoxy is, but they're pretty sure they don't like it. One of the things that I just experienced recently is a friend of mine who's a major mega force in the evangelical Christian world. And I've spent a lot of time having dinners with him over the years. I've had him on the Bible Answer Man broadcast. I mean, I like him on a personal level, played a lot of golf with him. But he came out in a video and he said that I joined something that ought to be not joined, but rather cursed. And, some of it was because he was talking about how when I was chrismated, a rag was placed on my head. And that rag was infused with divine light and life and these kinds of things. And he didn't understand what that was. And so, he had a very, very bad opinion of that. But he also makes this dichotomy that's been made in the Western Church between faith and works. As you well know, Father Themi, in the Eastern Church, never put faith up against works. It wasn't this dichotomization. We simply have the kind of faith that expresses itself in love. But in his mind, I had embraced some kind of a crass system of works righteousness.
The dichotomy, you're quite right, begins as an unfortunate misunderstanding by Martin Luther. He didn't mean to, but when he was given the job of lecturing the letter to the Galatians, and it's true, it's in Galatians, it says you are justified by your faith. But then if we look further in Galatians, and the fruit of the Spirit, if you are Spirit-filled, then you have to show love, you have to show joy, you have to show administration. There's all these gifts that are shown that are part of, well, I guess you could call the works part. But it seems as if Martin Luther, whom I respect, by the way, gave us this false dichotomy, and the West has stuck to that ever since. So that's part of the misunderstanding as well. But if we look at the New Testament, if you look at what Jesus said, right, forget Martin Luther right now, look at what Jesus said. I was hungry and you came and fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink, right? I was naked and you clothed me. And then he will say, well, come, you who did this to the least of my brothers, you shall inherit the kingdom of God. And the verb that you did it, it's an action verb. It's a works. It's not a passive. It's an action-filled activity. Come and come into the kingdom. So salvation, according to Matthew 25, comes by works. Yeah. Salvation comes by works, according to Matthew 25, right? But what we do as a church is not take one paragraph or one teaching and then say that's it. We look at the totality of the New Covenant teachings and say, look, it looks like works are important. It looks like faith is very important. It looks like this. And then you come up with the conclusion, we need both faith and we need works. We don't try to divorce them. But unfortunately, in the case of Martin Luther, who was only interested in Galatians, he made that unfortunate emphasis on the one, forgetting the other.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is the emphasis that you're placing on this is taking the whole of Scripture and taking what Paul said, what Jesus said, what James said. I mean, what did James say? He said, you see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Now, again, I think the beauty of Orthodoxy...
Martin Luther wanted to drop the letter of James from the New Testament. I don't know if you know that or not.
Yeah, he called it an epistle of straw.
Yeah. But look, this is not to diminish in any way faith. My goodness, without faith in Jesus, we are lost. Without faith in Jesus, we can do nothing. Without faith in Jesus, we are absolutely nowhere. But because I believe in Jesus, because I love Jesus, because I have that faith, the gift of faith, I must now reciprocate by doing something to show that I have received the charisms. I have received the gifts. Now, I'm going to do something. Feed him. Take care of him. Because that's what he wants. That's what he told us to do. But without faith, look, this is non-negotiable. Faith is absolutely fundamental. And our Protestant brothers are right, of course. But what happens to works, though? To show your faith. Where is the works that show your faith? Anyway, let's move on, Hank.
Yeah, I want to move on, but let me just park on this for just a moment more, and then we'll move on to what you're talking about with respect to taking care of those who are downtrodden and needy. But I was thinking here about St. Mark the Ascetic, who offers perhaps the clearest statement in early church literature demonstrating that believers are not made righteous by good works, rather that true faith will manifest itself, as you just pointed out, in good works, and that without good works, one does not have genuine saving faith. But what he said, and this was in a treatise on those who think that they are made righteous by works. And I almost memorized this now because I love the way he put it, and I also love, his history. He had memorized virtually the whole Bible. And so he's a great example to all of us. But he said that when Scripture says he will reward every man according to his works, and I think he's there pointing to Matthew chapter 16, he says, do not imagine that works in themselves merit either hell or the kingdom. On the contrary, Christ rewards each man according to whether his works are done with faith or without faith in himself. And he is not a dealer bound by contract, but God, our Creator and our Redeemer. And I thought that was profound and kind of sums up the whole situation. But let's move on. Let's talk about your works in Sierra Leone. You have told me on occasion that there are some 20,000 children each and every day that die of hunger, and that is an atrocity that ought to be in the forefront of the minds of Christians.
Hank, forgive me, but the figure is 25,000 die each day in the world, of which 17.5 are in Africa, and they are all under 5 years of age. So today, 17,500 children died in Africa under the age of 5, and tomorrow another 17,500 will die. That's enough every day to fill a stadium in NBA, even more than an NBA match between the Boston Celtics and the New York, whatever they call
the Knicks.
That it would be, the Boston Garden could not fit 17,000 people, I don't think. Well, let's say they could. That would be every day so many children dying of hunger and poverty and diseases. That is the biggest scandal that I think the world is facing today. Sometimes, now I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to stand out here and go on a limb, but, we, of course, you particularly in America have a big problem with shooters and gun issues. Now, I'm not American, and I'm not going to step into your controversy, particularly in the light of the Second Amendment. But I will say this: that yes, that is shocking what is happening in the States. All these shootings every so often, and maybe there is something to be said for gun control. But when you consider how many people die of shootings in America every year, what would it be, Hank? Would it be 2,000, 3,000? What would it be? What would be the total?
It might be a little higher than that, but I mean, it's significant. But the point is, by comparison, it's insignificant.
By comparison, every day, poverty kills 17,500 kids in Africa. Now, I'm not diminishing by any means, and please, I hope nobody misunderstands me. I'm not diminishing the people who died in the States through some crazy guy killing them. That is absolutely horrible, and may God have mercy on those people who died. But all I'm saying is, while we should be up in arms about that, then how much more up in arms should we be about the scandal of 17,500 kids dying every day?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember you saying that with the Ebola crisis, it wasn't until Ebola affected Americans that Americans paid any attention to what was going on in Africa. And now we have the monkeypox, and the same thing is happening again. That's resurfaced in Nigeria, but it really doesn't register on our radar until it starts affecting someone in the U.S.
Well, not only the U.S., but also in Europe. I mean, the European Union did the same thing. Great Britain, the UK did the same thing. They were not interested. We were dying there, and there was no foreign help whatsoever. If anything, they were shutting down transport. The British Airways shut down. They flew no more into Sierra Leone. Some of the other carriers shut down. Ships would refuse to come to port to bring supplies. If anything, we were being shut down. And to repeat, as you correctly point out, when the threat became imminent for Europe, a nurse went back to London carrying the Ebola virus. Well, now suddenly everybody was interested in the UK, and they did send help, and we have to acknowledge that, and we thank them. The same thing with the US when the Liberian gentleman came over and carried the Ebola virus. Suddenly, there was a lot of help that came from the U.S. to Liberia. So, unfortunately, there is a double standard here. And also, it's as if there are two planets in this world. There is the so-called third world, and then the so-called first world. And every time I fly from one to the other, it's so obvious that this disparity, this economic disparity exists between the really poor nations. By the way, the 10 poorest nations in the world are all in Africa. The 10 poorest nations in the world are all in Africa. So it's just an amazing drama that we seem not to be much concerned about.
You've been right in the middle of it. I mean, you were in the epicenter of the Ebola crisis. I mean, you saw people dying in the streets. And what I thought was incredible as an Orthodox priest, that you are giving the Eucharist to people in the midst of all of this, and no one died.
Yes, no one died. Nobody died. And it's just, nobody died.
They were experiencing the real presence of Christ, and they trusted in that so much that in the midst of an epidemic...
Well, I can tell you something else. I was in the midst of an HIV/AIDS crisis in Kenya when I was there a few years ago before I went to Sierra Leone. And I was given a parish in Nairobi, on the outskirts of Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. And 1/3 of my congregation had HIV or AIDS. At least 1/3. May God forgive me if I'm exaggerating or lessening the numbers, but a substantial number had HIV or full-blown AIDS. Now, as you know, in our tradition, we give the holy cup, and then at the end of it, the priest has to consume it all himself. Have to consume it, right? So after I'd given communion to people who obviously had HIV, then at the end of it, I had to drink all the remains from the cup, the remain, with all the saliva that had been put into the spoon and then into the cup. I can assure you, Hank, I don't have HIV/AIDS.
Talk for a minute about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I mean, this is something that was a unanimous belief of the church through Martin Luther. Martin Luther said, if there is one thing I could have disagreed with the papists on, it would have been the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. But the unanimous testimony of the church is that Christ is really present. And I don't know if you know this, Father Themi, I'm sure you probably do, but there was a colloquy. And in that colloquy between Martin Luther and Zwingli, the Swiss reformer, asked Martin Luther, how could Christ really be present in the Eucharist? And this was in the context of him accusing Luther of bread worship. And Luther responded by saying, if you can explain to me how Christ can be one person with two natures, I'll explain to you how Christ can really be present in the Eucharist. Now, this is an example of why I am so excited about the Eucharist, because in my previous Christian life, I partook of the Eucharist or the Lord's table occasionally. However, it was always considered to be a remembrance as opposed to the real presence of Christ. And now when I partake of the Eucharist, I'm recognizing that I'm partaking of uncreated energy, for only God is uncreated. And so something dynamic and profound is taking place. And I think that is the pearl of great price. I mean, it is the grace by which, one of the graces, but a chief grace, the chief grace, by which I can become, by grace, what God is by nature. I can never become what God is in the Godhead, but I can experience the graces whereby I can become a partaker in the divine nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hank, let me help you out a bit here. For those of your listeners who say, wait a minute, that's not in the scriptures, okay? Let me take you somewhere that is often forgotten by biblical scholars. John chapter, I think 8, I could be wrong, but I don't have it at the moment in my mind correctly, the exact chapter and verse. But I'm sure you know, some of your listeners would remember what I'm saying. Jesus says to them, unless ye eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, ye shall not have life. And then it says, and some of them left him. Some of the so-called disciples there, I mean, not the 12, but the others, left him. And it explains why. Because this was a hard saying. Now, here's my point. Why would they leave him if it was just a remembrance thing? If it was just, look, just do this here's a cup of wine and some bread. Do this in remembrance of me. That's not a hard saying. But what he says was, tuto esti, this is my blood. This is my body. He who does not drink or eat of it shall not have life. And some of them left him for that saying because it was a hard saying. Now, it doesn't take a PhD from Harvard to work out that he didn't just mean there, he didn't mean it just to be, well, look, when you get together, just, get some bread out, some wine out, and just remember me. If that was the case, why would they leave him? The Jews were quite used to these celebrations of wine and bread. There was nothing scandalous about it, but they were scandalized by that saying.
Yeah, it's absolutely true.
People around him.
Yes.
I'm sure you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Passage.
In fact, it's John chapter 6, and the context is just as you say. I mean, the Jews were arguing among themselves, how can this man, they're talking about Jesus, how can he give us his flesh to eat? And then Jesus responds, again, just as you said, Jesus tells them, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you, because whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life.
Because it was a hard saying. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's...
So why would they leave him? Yeah. In other words, they misunderstood him, exactly what he meant. They misunderstood it. And the other, by the way, furthermore, Hank, in the early catacombs of Rome, when the authorities, the Roman authorities, would send down spies to report back on the Christians and what they were doing, among the reports that were coming back to the Roman authorities of the catacomb Christians was one that they appeared to be immoral. And the reason for that was because they were kissing each other, the kiss of peace, So that was misunderstood as being immoral by the Roman spies, okay? The other one was, and they perceived that they were cannibals. These Christians are cannibals. Now, why would they say that? If you read, I'm sure you come across it in the early Christian reports in the early Roman reports about the Christians, and they're accused of cannibalism. Why would they be accused of cannibalism? Because they would turn up and say, you are now drinking his blood and now eating his flesh. So, and the Romans who were there spying, thought, oh my goodness, they're eating the flesh of someone they had just killed, whose name was Christus. You understand? So, further reinforcement there.
And again, there's so much reinforcement throughout church history. This was the unanimous belief of all Christians for 16 centuries.
Yes. Right up to Martin Luther, as you point out. It was only after Martin Luther, after 1,500 years of Christianity, that somehow people were now enlightened. After 1,500 years separation from the apostolic church, that suddenly we're enlightened now and we know better than the apostles.
I want to get to something else, but something you just said, I think it bears elaboration. The Orthodox are not innovators. They're trying to perpetuate what the Judeo-Christian tradition was. In other words, the tradition passed on from Jesus to the apostles, from the apostles to the early church. They're not seeking to try to come up with something new, but rather to perpetuate the faith once for all delivered to the saints.
Yes, and that becomes, for modern Orthodoxy, a kind of a blessed dilemma, in the sense that you look at the Pentecostal churches and the way they worship, and It's in a very contemporary manner. It's almost like going, and I hope nobody misunderstands me, and I say with due humility, it's like going to a sort of a rock concert. It's like going to and it's very well done to attract people, and there's a lot of music, there's a lot of modern contemporary music, there's a lot of preaching, which is fantastic. I love preaching, but the whole structure is in a very modern, contemporary manner, using all forms of modern technology, from the television to the sound system, to the presentation, to the stage setup. It's all extremely modern. On the other hand, we cannot attract that kind of 20,000 people in one sitting, simply because, and I find that in Africa as well, that because the African people by nature have a tendency for dancing and singing, and they love, they love to express themselves, in a sort of a, by singing and dancing and so forth. So the Orthodox tradition can be somehow for the African, if it's presented in a very European way, quite challenging. So what we do in Sierra Leone, we take the tradition that was handed on to us by the fathers through the liturgy, but it doesn't say anywhere in the liturgy that we have to stand like statues, we in the congregation. It doesn't say that. I don't find that anywhere in the liturgical structure, right? So what we do in Africa is adopt the tradition and then apply it in an African context where people are allowed to shout out, hallelujah, or shout out, blessed be the Lord, or whatever. So in other words, we, while still using the tradition, what we do is we apply St. Paul's principle: to the Greek I became Greek, to the Jew I become Jewish, to the weak I become weak, and to the strong I become strong. I become all people for the sake of the gospel of Christ. So what we do is we take the traditions of Orthodoxy and color them in an African manner.
I can't help but say this. I mean, I got up at 5:30 this morning. I was at work before 6, and now in Charlotte, North Carolina, it's 8 o'clock at night.
Hank, I got up at 4, okay?
Okay, so you beat me. But here's my point. That's exactly the point I wanted to get to. I mean, the thing that is, the thing that is absolutely amazing, and this is the point I wanted to make and have you elaborate on, but, I have cancer. You have a lot of physical issues as well. You can go into them if you want to or not. But here's the thing.
I'm really blind, yeah.
Yeah, here's the point I want to make. I think it's absolutely stunning that God has given me the energy and enthusiasm that I have. And then when I talk to you, I think, wow, here is Father Themi. He's struggling with a lot of things. He's in Australia now. He's serving in Sierra Leone. I mean, he has so many things to deal with. And yet, when I'm talking to you, the passion is exuding from every single pore. And I think that's just absolutely heavenly.
Well, brother, it comes from faith, doesn't it? I mean, without faith, and now this is not to make it a dichotomy between faith and works, but unless there is the gift of faith, it's all not going to happen. It becomes a routine. It becomes a career. It becomes a job. It becomes a money-making enterprise. It becomes an organization. You build an organization, and then finally the organization is more important than the actual faith that made that organization to be what it is. So at the end of it all, we base ourselves on the gift that God has given us, unworthy as I am, and so forth. But if it wasn't for that faith, they wouldn't be able to do those things. So I give glory to God. I give glory to Him, for giving the gift of faith.
You are just so exciting to be around. Now, don't blame me for this, Father Themi, but you brought it up. You mentioned, concerts and churches that kind of make it look like a rock event, but you are a rock star yourself. Talk about that.
Well, that's why I kind of understand what they're doing, and that's what I meant by them using contemporary methodology, and that's why people go to them. That's why the Pentecostals are so successful, and I have to admit that. And they're very successful in Africa. The most successful Christian group at the moment, in terms of numbers, is undoubtedly the Pentecostal churches, all right? So, because they present their message in a very contemporary manner. Whereas we in the Orthodox Church, and of course our Catholic brothers as well, we have the tradition. We can't play around with that. Otherwise, we're not Orthodox or we're not Catholic. But my point is, that's okay. That's great. We've got the treasure. Now, let's contemporize it, not by losing anything from it, but giving it the flavor of where you are, the geographical, cultural flavor. For example, in America, the Orthodox churches, I believe, humbly I say that, with due respect to, I'm sure everybody's thought about it before me, but there would need to be some missionary churches in the United States that are there specifically doing everything in English, doing everything to, as it were, translate Orthodoxy into the American culture, Americanizing it, if you wish, but without losing Orthodoxy. That's what the Russians have done. That's what the Greeks have done. That's what the Bulgarians have done. That is what the Serbians have done. That is what we say the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox. So there is a place for Americanizing Orthodoxy. In the same way that it's been, there's a Russian Orthodox tradition, there's a Serbian Orthodox tradition. It's still the same, but it has a Serbian flavor. It's still the same, but it has a Russian flavor. It's still the same, but it has a Greek flavor, okay? It's the flavor that is different. But the essence is absolutely the same. So what I'm doing in Africa is giving it the African flavor.
Hey, you're not getting out of this. I brought up your past, and that is you were a rock star.
Sorry. No. Let me go there. No, I'm sorry. You're quite right. The rock star. Yeah. When I was up to the age of 18, 19, I was an atheist, a total atheist. I did not believe in God, and I didn't have any time for Christianity. I just considered Christianity to be a waste of time. It's a religion for those who are weak, and they have to have something to hang on to, and the only thing they can hang on to is this concept of a God that is somewhere else above. But for me, as a rational, intelligent human being, such things are not, as a Marxist, to kick in as well, the opium of the masses. So I had no thought for Christianity, let alone Orthodox Christianity. But the rock days came just before that. It came with the cultural assault of the Beatles, where they revised everything of the 50s. They revised the Presley years. They revised the Fonz years. They revised the Beatnik years. They revised the Connie Francis and Frankie Avalon years. And they brought something absolutely new, which is sort of a rebellious spirit. And the long hair, the screaming, in their record, high energy. As a 17-year-old, 18-year-old who already was playing guitar just in an amateur way, that just blew my mind away. So obviously, I wanted to be an Australian Beatle. So we formed an Australian Beatle group. Now, what are we going to call ourselves? By the way, the Beatles called themselves after the Crickets. Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So they got an insect, right? So they called themselves the Beatles. So we had to be an insect. What kind of an insect are we going to be? Well, it could have been a cockroach, or it could have been, a centipede. But we chose the flies. We chose the worst insect, the most annoying insect, the fly. Okay? So we formed the Flies. And we had success. We had success in Australia. We had fan clubs. We did tours. We played with the Rolling Stones opening. We were the opening gig kind of thing. We played with, we're opening act for Little Millie, My Boy Lollipop, who was a huge success back in the 60s. And the beginning of reggae music. She was a Jamaican singer who had #1 hit. I'm not sure whether she made it in the U.S. Anyway, so from there to Marxism, to eventually a Christian conversion, and then losing all my friends, all my cool friends, because I'd become uncool by becoming a Christian, you see.
Well, even before that, you had this kind of unusual mixture of, you call it a Marcusian mixture of Freud and Marx. You were a Marxist.
Yes, we were neo-Marxist. It was part of the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. America was involved in the Vietnam War. You were killing the Vietnamese people. And so we, the students, had to rise up and defend the unjust war. And Australia had been, we were saying all the way with LBJ, because LBJ had come to Australia. We, the students, had gone out in the streets to throw, tomatoes and pelt him with eggs, and we were being chased by the police because, we were trying to throw eggs at LBJ. Anyway, so the story goes something like this, that the eventuality of all that was that I eventually found Christ. And the story is a little bit complicated, but, Christ came through it all.
That's a beautiful story, actually.
It's interesting how from one rebellion to another rebellion, because I really see, if you really believe in Jesus, it's a revolutionary movement. It's revolutionary. How come? Well, look, first of all, you've got to get rid of every ounce of your old self. You've got to go through an internal revolution. You've got to get rid of your anger. You've got to get rid of your hatred, your jealousies. You've got to start learning to forgive. You've got to put up with people who are insulting you, and you have to say, no worries, no problem, God bless you, have a nice day, There's an internal revolution. And then there's a social revolution. I mean, Christians are not considered today in the light of, say, Black Lives Matter, or in the light of Antifa, or in the light of the latest American groups that are now rising up, in the anti-Trump movement and so forth. We Christians are always considered to be the conservatives, the ones who are the right-wingers. In fact, if you look at Christianity correctly, what you will find is that we are actually very, very radical if we take the teachings correctly. We are to distribute our wealth. We are to give to the poor. We are to humble ourselves before others. We are to put ourselves last. We are to forgive our enemy. Now, don't tell me that's easy. And don't tell me that comes naturally. That does not come naturally. There has to be a lot of struggle to achieve these things. So I really consider that when I became from Marxist to Christian, that I was really jumping from one revolutionary movement to another revolutionary movement, the Jesus Revolution, which thanks be to God, it's a peaceful love revolution. And I'm so grateful for having been considered worthy, or whatever term, to be part of that revolution. Hank, and you're a part of it too, mate.
I am part of it. I don't want to miss this part of it because you are so incredibly interesting and inspiring. You, at one point in your life, loved academics, and I said this at the open of the show. You got a master's at Princeton, a doctorate at Brown. I don't know what other degrees you have, but you probably have others as well. But the point here is that you were an academic, but you felt that there was a higher calling.
Yes. Yeah, I tell you what, I've got two doctorates, one in education, one in the so-called PhD. But what I discovered was, brother, that academia, unless used correctly to foster humanity and to bring new knowledge and to make discoveries that can help us and that can make our life better and so forth, and that there is a lot of academia is there. But there's also a dangerous academia, which is where I show you how smart I am with the information that I have and you don't have. And so a lot of it is also an ego game where, I know more than you. I know Hebrew. You don't know Hebrew. I know Aramaic. You don't know Aramaic. And it becomes an ego thing at the end, you see. So unless it can be used correctly and it can be used properly, it can also hurt you. It can also turn around and hurt you. Now, by the way, we need knowledge and we need to go ahead and we need academia. We really need academia. Academia is essential for human progress. Where we would be today, I wouldn't be able to talk to you unless these phones work right now. And these phones are a result of academia and research. Or, my brother Hank, with your condition right now, unless it was for academic research, you're talking about stem cells. My goodness, that's the most razor edge, research right now for cancer therapy. So, by no means should we even consider questioning academia. What I'm questioning is not academia. I'm questioning the way some academics become arrogant. Some academics become big-headed in their knowledge. And instead of using that knowledge to help others, they're actually using it for their own ego, you see. And I didn't want to fall into that trap.
There's something else in this regard I think that's interesting when you talk about Eastern Orthodoxy as opposed to the snarling logicality in the Western world. The Eastern Church was willing to leave things shrouded in mystery. I'm talking about things like, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, the mystery that causes us to tremble and yet attracts us. This mystery is something that's very significant. And when you had a Damascus Road experience, there was a mysterium in that.
Yeah, look, there's truth in what you say, that the West, and part of the reason why the West is probably technologically more advanced than any other part of the globe, although now, of course, China and Japan have absolutely caught up, and maybe they're at the razor's edge right now. But the reason why originally the West was at the forefront of technological progress is precisely what you just said, that everything had to be seen through the prism of rationality and logic, which, by the way, is a function of the Renaissance, which is, again, going back to a revival of the ancient Greek Aristotelian logic. So the West developed this sense of reason and rationality, and it which helped it to put a man on the moon and helped it to have heart transplants and helped it to develop airplanes and so forth. But on the other hand, what the Western churches did is they adopted that rationality full on, and as you say, leaving behind the mysterion. And when I was studying at Harvard, the New Testament, everything was mythological, because everything in the New Testament had to be seen through logic and reason, and so therefore, it's not possible, according to reason, for someone to walk on water. How can that happen, right? It's not possible for Jonah to be in the whale for 3 days. That just just can't happen, right? So it's not logical. Since it's not logical or rational, and given that's the fundamental ideology of the West since the so-called Enlightenment, then, therefore, the New Testament has mythological elements in it, which can be refuted. And at the end of the day, when you study, and I have great respect for Harvard, by the way, very great respect, But when you do study there, at the end of it, you'll come out more or less saying, well, most of the Bible is mythological. All we can say about Jesus is simply that, okay, he lived and he died on the cross, and that's about it. That's what Rudolf Bultmann, very famous German scholar, says. That's all we know about Jesus. He lived and died on the cross. Beyond that, it's all myth. We don't know anything more. Okay? Now, why did that happen? Because the embrace of reason, the embrace of rationality at the cost of mystery, at the cost of the meta-logical, the meta-rational, that which is beyond logic, that which is beyond reason. You see, this is where Orthodoxy is to some degree, and where the West has abandoned to some degree, you know. So I think you're right.
I want to talk a little more about mystical experiences, because you had a mystical experience you told me about at one time in one of our conversations, and that mystical experience had something to do with the fact that you idolized the Beatles in many ways, and you ended up going to an ashram, and you had a cross on, not because you believed in the power of the cross, but rather because it was a fashion statement. And so you had this cross, and you were told by someone in an ashram that you ought to take that cross off, and something rose within you, and that's a story in itself.
Correct. That incited something, and that was reinforced by what can be described as mystical experiences of Christ. I would never have ever, in my logical Western way of thinking, I would never have turned to God. As I told you before, for me, all that were myths, right? And any logical person cannot possibly, I would say to myself, believe that someone lived in a whale for 3 days. It's just impossible. So why do people believe those things, you know? And therefore, you know, in a way, debasing Christianity as some sort of very superstitious teaching. But when I had the mystical experiences, when I had the experience of the presence of Christ, you know, unworthy and sinful as I am, that turned everything around, Hank. It turned everything around. The atheist became a Christian. The Marxist became a Christian. The rock star, scoffed all those things and only wanted to know Christ. And you're so right. You know, there is something that we simply have to bow our heads before. In Isaiah chapter 6, where the prophet Isaiah is in the temple in Jerusalem, and suddenly the glory of God appears to him. And he falls on his face and says, oh, no, I've seen the glory of God. I'm going to die now, you know. But that unexpected epiphany, that unexpected coming of the glory of God is so awesome. And had it not been, look, if anybody had argued to me on a logical level about the existence of God, I would have just dismissed it. Because really, if you argue logically about the existence of God, I can come up with a counter-argument. For every argument that you can make for, that, let's say I can make for the existence of God, a Marxist can make just as an effective counter-argument against it, you see. So therefore, eventually we cannot rely on our reason to believe. Eventually, we rely on the gift of faith. Now, I understand that some people will say, well, that's dangerous because it means that now you've abandoned logic, you've abandoned reason, and you're believing in something you call a mystery, which may not be real. It may be a fantasy. But here is the point, that this fantasy that the person standing outside cannot understand is that it's a reality to those of us who have been touched. It's a living reality. It's not something that we imagine. It's not something that we are dreaming of. It's real to those who receive it. And that's how it is. That's how it is, you know?
And you said something to me once that's always stuck in my mind. You said that fame is empty, and you would know about that, but Christianity has no expiration date. Elaborate on that.
Yeah. I don't know whether you've experienced atheism or not. I'm not sure, Hank. But having experienced it myself, it just led me from one confusion to another. One day you are a Marxist and you're following this particular road, and you believe you're on the moral high ground because you're supporting this and that and that, and then suddenly that is no longer now considered to be politically correct, and you need to change that, and you need to move to somewhere else, and it becomes very confusing, keeping up all the time with the atheist agenda, right? I use the term loosely. I use the term the secular agenda. That with Christ, there is that comfort. There is that knowledge that what you are doing, despite everything around you that contradicts it, despite everything around you that is telling you you shouldn't do that, right? But you know it's right, and you have that strength that it is right. And that is the eternal aspect of Christianity, that you have that eternal comfort that, yes, I'm misunderstood now. Yes, that people think that what I'm doing now is I'm wasting my time. I'm wasting my humanity on things that cannot be seen or whatever. But you know it's right. And that knowledge of that rightness gives you that inner strength, Hank, that you have received and are going through right now with your cancer challenge. But you're going through it in a way that I suppose an unbeliever would find it very hard. I'm not saying all, but I'm saying some unbelievers would have no hope of the comfort of the love of God. How could they pull through all this? But you can, in an amazing way.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I actually can say this. Last time we were together in person in New York, I'd never been sick a day in my life. And then all of a sudden, on April 15th of this year, I'm diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma. And you would think at this point that I would be thinking, wow, why me? And why did this have to happen? I have this incredible opportunity to serve the Lord. God's opened up all these new doors for me and all of this. Why do I have this? But you know what? This has caused me to order my life around the divine. And I can honestly say that this has been one of the most glorious years of my life. Yes, there's some physical struggle, but it has been such an opportunity to trust in the Lord with all my heart and lean not upon my own understanding.
Yes, and not only that, Hank, but now you understand more than ever the pain of others. Now you understand more than ever what it's like for someone to be hit hard with some disease, and they're struggling for life, and they don't know whether they'll make it or not. Your empathy for them is greater than ever before.
That's right.
And that gives you a greater sensitivity, a greater sympathy, and a greater knowledge of the inner workings of the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And, by the way, you got through this pretty good when I asked you about Christianity has no expiration date. I mean, I really liked what you had to say, but you're not getting out of the other part of it. I'm getting back to it. And that is, you said fame is empty, and there's no one that can talk about it better than you, because you had fame. You had thousands, tens of thousands of people just screaming their lungs out. I've seen it on video. And you had that fame and fortune, but you've pointed out that it, at the end of the day, is empty. Explain that.
Yeah, it expires. And not only that, you look at some great people of the past that have had incredible fame. Look at some of the your own basketball players or some of your own baseball players who now nobody has ever heard of them. But whereas back in the 50s, they were household words. You look at some of your great football players, and in their day, they were the biggest thing alive. And nowadays, people don't even know who they are. The new generation hasn't even heard of them. Or in the rock industry, in the musical industry, I mean, the groups like, I'm going to mention groups now that you've never ever heard of, the Yardbirds, the Kinks, I'm trying to think of groups that were very big, but now forgotten. The Small Faces, they were huge in the 60s and 70s, huge. They ruled the world. Who remembers now the Kinks or the Small Faces or the Who or the Yardbirds? They were huge, man. Absolutely, they ruled the world, right? The youth world. But they're gone. It's all gone. It's all expired, Whereas we still remember a young woman called Catherine who lived 1,500 years ago, in Egypt, Saint Catherine. We remember someone who lived, 1,700 years ago in Thessalonica, Saint Demetrius or something, So in Christ, you're never forgotten. It may not mean, of course, becoming a saint or something like that, but God does not forget. And that's what I'm referring back to. There's no expiry, because you will not be forgotten by the Lord. Whereas if you give all your energies to other things, the chances of being forgotten, just like the Yardbirds, the Who, the Kinks, the Small Faces, and I could mention Peter Best, who was one of the greatest soccer players, Manchester United, or was it Everton? I can't remember. Great football player. I think he's on Skid Row. Even more recent great names that have been forgotten. The world is very fickle in whom it adores. It adores you for a year or two, and then it's all over. I mean, Elvis is probably a very good example that when the Beatles came and so forth, his star was waning. And by the 70s, he was completely out of fashion, and maybe that even caused his death. Who knows? Who knows?
That's so interesting. I see you, on the one hand, on a stage with tens of thousands of people screaming. On the other hand, I see you in Sierra Leone with your guitar, strumming the guitar, and you have these people that you're really pouring your lives into, kids that are so happy, and I see a sense of contentment on your face. They're wheeling you around in a wheelchair, or they're singing with you, and you seem to be at the peak of your happiness.
Well, something funny. One of the reasons I'm still in Australia, I should be back there, is I've lost my passport, right? And I'm in the process of getting a new one, but because you lose your passport, you cancel it, and then you have to start all over again. Whereas if you just go with your old passport and get a new one, it's a different process. And I'm sort of like here in the land of plenty, in a great nation, some of the best medical facilities in the world. Hank, we don't pay anything for medicine here. If you see a doctor, you don't pay anything. If you have,
I'm coming.
We don't pay. We don't pay for medicine here. If you get an X-ray or something like that, even then, we call it the Medicare system. We hardly pay anything for medicine. Anyway, but here I am in one of the great countries in the world with all the facilities, with all the greatest that the world can offer you, and I can't wait to get out. I can't wait to go back to Africa, to one of the poorest countries in the world. And I mean that. I mean that with sincerity. So, that's the irony of faith. That's the irony. Who would want to go to one of the poorest countries in the world and leave, and want eagerly, to go? Well, that's the mystery. We go back to the mystery of faith, Brother Hank.
Yeah.
Anyway, Hank, I realize we've got about an hour or so. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
You can't skip out on me right now.
Well.
You can't skip out on me right now. I got some other things I want to ask you.
Oh, sorry. I thought we had an hour. Go ahead.
No, with you, I don't care if it's 5 hours, because you're one of the most interesting, inspiring people on the planet, and that's exactly what I'm trying to bring to people all around the world. People like you, that we can, we can laugh, we can have a great amount of fun, but there's such richness that you have to share with people, and I just don't want to lose out on that. So if you got the energy, I want to go for a few more minutes. And I know you do, because I can tell. But the thing that I want to get to here before I let you go is you talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, and that is that there are two forms of existence on this planet. You have the haves and you have the have-nots, if you will, and you demonstrate that as you talk about your experience in Australia and then your experience in Sierra Leone. But you've pointed out to me, and I'm sure to many, many people around the world, that 60 or so percent of the world lives on $2 a day, and 80% if you go up to $3 a day. And so there's this incredible poverty. These are the incredible needs, and we have to start getting our hands dirty. We have to get involved.
Exactly. Hank, listen, I'll make it even more dramatic for you. 3 billion people on our planet, 3 billion, right? That's nearly half the world, is living under $2.50 a day, is living under $2.50 a day. And 67 families in the world control half the world's income. 67 families in the globe today, right, in our planet today, control half the world's money. And 3 billion are living under $2.50 a day. Figure that one out.
Well, that's incredible. So what should we be doing?
Well, we should be doing something about it. I mean, I can see people are jumping up and down about so many issues in the United States. And, you know, I'm not going to get involved in your controversies. That's up to you. But I can see people jumping up and down about the rights of this and the rights of that and so forth and so on. And I fine, okay. What about the rights of the children who are dying every day? What about the rights of 17,500 children dying every day? What happened to that right? You know, people get upset about, you know, gun control. Oh, you know, this and that, and I'm against gun control. I'm in favor of gun control. And they can kill each other over these arguments. And then you look around you next door and you've got people dying of hunger. So what I'm suggesting, Brother Hank, is that the first world's priorities are a little bit distorted at the moment. There's a bit of a myopic view of what is very important for us to be heading towards. And by doing so, we are neglecting, because of a myopic view of what is very important, the more important. And the more important is human life. Nobody can argue against the preciousness and the value of human life, whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, or a Christian. You can't deny the value of human life, okay? So how do you explain that here in Australia, in your beautiful country, in Europe, how come we don't talk about this? I mean, I get up in churches and I say, my first word is, today 17,500 kids are going to die of hunger in Africa, okay? That's my first statement. And people are saying, we don't know that. Look, let me tell you something else. In the Congolese war that started back in the 90s, there is something like, I don't know how many million people have died as a result of that war, right? When I come here and I talk about the Congolese war, that I think it's like 9 or 10 million people have died, I'm not sure. You can Google it and find out. But it's a huge amount of dead people as a result of the Congolese wars. And when I come here and I say, well, you know, the Congolese wars have caused this, they say, what's the Congo? Where's the Congo? Where's the Congo? What do you mean, where's the Congo? You know, no idea. And our schools, here in Australia at least, you know, God bless them, we have good schools. But the issue of teaching about poverty, teaching about the reality of third world poverty is just not covered. It's just not covered.
And you've kind of touched on this, but I kind of want to get back to this a little bit. Maybe you have something more to say. But what always baffles me is how the prosperity gospel can reach so many people in places like the Congo or in places like Nigeria. It just seems absolutely baffling to me that a gospel that is not a gospel at all can have such success, at least in terms of attracting people.
Well, I can explain that. When you get the prosperity gospel preached in Pentecostal churches in Africa, this is how it's done. Come to a service on Sunday. you're going to see a miracle. If you're not married, you will be married. If you are poor, you will have money. So they give him all these promises about how, if you're looking for a wife, or the pastor will pray for you and you'll get a wife. If you're looking for money, no problem. By attending the church, you'll become a winner. In fact, one of the churches is called the Winners' Chapel. The Winners' Chapel. That's what they call the church, the Winners' Chapel. And the other promise is, well, okay, if you come to us, you will receive. It's a promise that the Lord has made that you will become rich. It's a promise. It's a promise. Okay, so these people flock there, expecting, if you're a single male or female, that the Lord will, the church will make sure that you will get a husband and wife. The church will make sure that you will become rich. The church will make sure that if you are sick, you'll be healed. Okay, they promise that. They promise these things, right? So people turn up in flocks, expecting miracles, expecting to be married, expecting money, expecting to become millionaires. And when they don't, all right, then they drop out. But what happens is it's a revolving door. Others come in. You see, others come in. Whereas what we do, we don't promise anything. We don't promise that they're going to get rich. We don't promise, that you're going to get a miracle. We don't promise that, because only God can perform a miracle. I cannot order God to make a miracle. I cannot tell you tomorrow there's going to be a miracle. How can I say that? I don't know if tomorrow is going to be a miracle. If God wants to make a miracle, God will make a miracle. But I don't know. You see, I can't promise you that. So we don't promise anything, but what we do promise is that we're going to feed you after church. There's going to be a free meal. We're going to take care of your hunger in a realistic way. If you need counseling, we're going to take care of that. If you have some problems with financial issues, come and talk to us, see where we can help you. So in that way, we are building up a congregation that does not come to us on false pretenses, or at least on false promises, you see. So look, the prosperity gospel is very attractive in the poor world. Of course it's attractive.
I want to talk about one other thing with you, and this is something that came out of my own sort of facing mortality, knowing that I don't really care at this point what anybody thinks of me from a human perspective. What I do really care about is what God thinks. And so in this regard, particularly talking to you, I have been troubled and burdened about my own personal obligations to the kinds of things that you're talking about. In other words, when I stand before God, what will God think of me in terms of having known about what you have just communicated so beautifully, having known about the plight of the poor? What will God think if I didn't get my hands dirty, if I didn't get involved, if I didn't give, if in some way I didn't heed the call of the Lord to give a cup of cold water or at least a piece of bread in His name?
Correct. It is dangerous. Because Jesus tells us what will happen. He says, well, I was hungry and you did not come to me. I was thirsty and you did not give me to drink. I was naked and you didn't clothe me. I was in prison and you did not visit me. I was sick and you did not come to me. Be gone from my Father's house, be gone. And so I say to people, look, you can't. There's no negotiation on this issue. There's no negotiation. We Christians have to help the poor. There's no negotiation, right? And what I find in some of our more evangelical churches is, while there is a lot of stress on doctrine, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. I have no problem with that. It's really fantastic that people should be stressing, the correct doctrines and so forth according to what they think. Okay, fine. Okay, no problem. But what I have a problem with is you, not you, Hank, but just you in general, stress doctrine, and you condemn someone because he or she is going to the wrong church. You condemn someone because they may have an icon. You condemn them for that. But then when it comes to what Jesus said about helping the poor, you don't do anything. So you're quite happy to condemn someone who is, who believes in, say, the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is the real presence of Christ. You are willing to condemn such a person, and you make it into a big deal, as if to say, well, you see, he believes in the real presence. He's a heretic, and I am not, and you kind of get a lot of joy out of that, right? And on the other hand, when Jesus tells you, I'm not talking to you, Hank, I'm just talking the general you. And when Jesus tells us, I'll use another pronoun. When Jesus tells us that he was hungry and we didn't go to him, and he was thirsty and we didn't go to him, right? And then he condemns us for that we don't care about. But we say we believe in him. How can you believe in him when he's condemning you? He's condemning you because you're not doing something so dear to his heart, helping the poor.
That is so convicting. And maybe the last thing I want to ask you to elucidate for those thousands and thousands of people listening in. So often the Christian faith can be transactional in the sense that you pray a prayer and now you have, as it were, you have a card that gets you into heaven and a card that keeps you out of hell. But the Christian faith is not transactional, it's transformational. I mean, there should be something that happens within us that is transformational. Talk about that. Explain that to people.
Yes, absolutely. From glory to glory in the image of God. We have lost that. And it's like, look, I think you put it better than I did, actually. It's the struggle towards be perfect, be holy as my Father is holy, right? And part of the process of that stairway, that ladder towards holiness, it's a step by step that Christ himself has given to us. So I couldn't agree more, Hank. You've nailed it. The Christian life is a journey. It's a transformational. We call it metamorphosis. It's a transfiguration, if we're going to use the Orthodox word. It's a process of transfiguration from the worldly to the heavenly, from the secular to the divine, from the sinful to the perfect, to the holy. And that is the journey that we are on. And in that journey, we have obligations so that we can reach the higher level, the glory to glory to glory to glory. And part of that obligation, which is not negotiable, is helping the poor.
There is no one that I would have rather spent this time with. I mean, I truly admire you, and I'm so grateful that God has brought you into my life as a friend, someone who prays for me, and someone who is a model for me in so many different ways. I truly love you. Thank you so much for...
Well, Hank, when I come to the States, maybe next year or maybe end of the next year, I really want to spend time with you. And I know you'll be in fine shape by then. You're going through a hard time now, but I know that by maybe next year, some point, end of next year, middle of next year, you'll be running around again in a fine, beautiful way. So please, keep a day open for me. We'll have a nice cup of coffee. But by the way, I prefer a cappuccino with 2 sugars. Okay, so. Okay, buddy. Take care. Regards to your wife and family, and to the deacon in the church there, and the Holy Fathers. By the way, Deacon Paul, is coming over to Sierra Leone.
Oh, he's fantastic. He is one of the most fantastic people I have ever met in my life. And I mean, he gave a homily this past week about Luke chapter 16, the rich man and Lazarus. It was one of the most extraordinary homilies I've ever heard.
I know. Please send him my sincere best wishes and tell him I'm looking forward to his visit.
And I'm going to come over there and see you sometime as well. As soon as I am able, I'm coming to Sierra Leone.
I wish you could.
I'm going to.
I wish you could, but Yeah, but just get this medical thing out of the way first, okay?
I will do it. Father Themi, I love you. Thank you so much.
I love you too, man. Christ be with you. The living Christ. Take care, my
Christ
friend.
is risen. And that is my discussion with Father Themi. He is one of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. I mean, you think about his enthusiasm for life. I'm not going to tell you how old he is because I don't want you to know how old I am. But it is absolutely stunning to see the excitement that he has for every day of life. And I call him the Mother Teresa of Orthodoxy, and he's been such an example to me. And quite frankly, knowing him and watching how he lives has been a real challenge. Again, when you face your own mortality, it becomes a real challenge, because who cares what anybody else thinks when you stand before God? Is he going to say, well done, good and faithful servant? At the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. Well, as I promised, I'm bringing some of the most interesting people on the planet right to you. And if you appreciated this podcast, the Hank Unplugged podcast, and Father Themi, go to iTunes, give us a 5-star rating. It helps to get these kinds of messages out to a world that desperately needs to hear them. Again, thank you so much for listening to Hank Unplugged. It is the podcast that is touching lives all over the planet. And again, when you share, when you subscribe, when you rate, when you review, it means that you've taken an action step that is helping this podcast continue to make a difference. So you're part of the team and part of the process. So please do that. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Hank Unplugged. Look forward to seeing you next time with more of the podcast.